Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Tsinghua University, Beijing. And my name is Da Zhang, and I am an associate professor at the Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy in Tsinghua University. Today, I'm very honored to give a lecture on the policy practices of China's emission trading scheme. Well, this new policy was newly introduced in China, and this emission trading scheme, the ETS, has started formal operation since July this year. And our institute has been supporting the policy making of these policies. So today I'm very honored to share some knowledge and experience about the development of China's emission trading scheme. As you know, this is the 7th class of the course on carbon neutrality. And today, I will first introduce some background about emission trading scheme. And second, I will briefly describe the development of the ETS in China. And lastly, I will also briefly discuss the potential impacts of China's ETS on its power system decarbonization. Well, first, some background, a little bit theory. Well, we may have also all heard the tragedy of the commons. Actually, climate change issue is a very classic example of the tragedy of commons. Well, for example, if we would like to control the temperature increase by the end of this century within 2 degrees, the global CO2 emissions cumulatively by the end of this century should not exceed 1,000 gigatons. But we know countries, well, if without economic incentive, they would not reduce their emissions. Therefore, we need some market-based approaches to address this tragedy of the commons. Well, there are usually very two common types of policy interventions to price carbon externalities. We call it externality because if we do not control the emissions, well, the high concentration of the CO2 will cause a lot of problems, to our world. The extreme climate events and all, the sea level increase will all bring all kind of, very bad outcomes. Well, we need the carbon pricing tools to address these externalities. And there are two most popular type of the carbon pricing tool. One is carbon tax. And you see the photo of Arthur Cecil Pigou, and he is one of the earliest economists to raise the idea about carbon tax. Well, he said, well, the original idea, I should say, the environmental tax, well, it could be applied to carbon or it could be applied to other pollutants. So he said, with the pollution, we may have the environmental damage. Therefore, we need to put a price to the pollution. And usually, if we set the tax rate equal to the, the marginal cost of the pollution, or say the carbon emissions, we should, solve this problem. And the carbon tax could be also called one form of the Pigovian tax, named after Pigou. And you also see another photo of another very famous economist, Ronald Coase, and he was one of the earliest people raised the idea about the emission trading. Well, with the emission trading scheme, if the government or if there's a scheme to allocate the property rights of the emission permits, and then we allow the entities to trade in the market, and it will also address this issue. It will also help to reduce the emissions according to the Coase theorem. So basically, this is the economic theory of the carbon pricing. And as we see, emission trading scheme is one of the two most typical form of these carbon pricing tools. And then, well, if we look at these two policies, carbon tax, actually, as we have already briefly described, it is a price policy. So the tax rate or the price that we would like to add on a unit of carbon emissions, say a ton of carbon emissions, will be set by the authorities. However, the resulting emission reduction is unknown. So that's why we say the price is certain under carbon tax. Carbon tax is a price policy. Well, how about the emission trading scheme? Well, actually, the ETS is a quantity policy. The authorities could set the total emission cap. However, the resulting carbon price is unknown ex ante, because the firms participating in the ETS, they will discover the price of the carbon, but this is a price signal automatically emerge from the market. It is not set by the government. Therefore, ETS, under the ETS, the total emissions cap or the total emission reduction is certain. So it's a quantity policy. Well, which one is better? Probably this is the most famous question, and this is also the longest debate in the field of environmental economics. There's one very famous paper called Prices versus Quantities, or in short, PVQ, and you can see there is a seminal paper by Harvard professor Martin Weissman in 1974. So this debate has started almost 50 years ago, and it is still ongoing. Well, according Professor Weissman's analysis, he said, well, in an ideal and deterministic setting, two policies are equally efficient as long as the carbon price is equal to the social cost of carbon. But also according to his study, if there are uncertainties, carbon tax tends to be more economically efficient. However, the stories are much more complicated if we look at the real world. It is more complicated if we consider, political feasibility, transaction costs, and companion policies. If we look at the policy practices in the world, we see there are already 64 countries and regions that have adopted or plan to adopt carbon pricing tools. Well, carbon pricing tools, as I said, includes both carbon tax and ETS. And we see that about 30 carbon markets have established, and about 35 carbon taxes have been also introduced. So you see, both of these tools have been applied in reality, and regions or countries choose their preference based on all kinds of reasons. Well, since today's focus is emission trading scheme, the ETS, so let me first give a very simple example, or maybe the simplest emission trading scheme in a very small world. So in this very small world, we have two emitters. We have two factories, emitter A and emitter B. Well, emitter A has some smoke coming out from their stacks. So this amount of smoke represent the emissions of emitter A before any policy is introduced. And on the left, there is the other emitter B. It also has some level of emissions, and the smoke represents the CO2 emissions from this emitter B. And now the government says, well, we want to control the emissions. We want to reduce the emissions from emitter A and emitter B. And the government says, well, let's draw a line to make sure that the emissions from any, well, either factory or emitter is below this line. So this line is represented here as a red dashed line. So then you can see the emitter A has emissions higher than this line, and emitter B has emissions lower than this line. But actually, the government only cares about the total emissions, especially for CO2, because CO2 is a global pollutant. It doesn't matter, which factory or which emitter have CO2 emissions. So the only thing matters the total emissions from, the whole world. So in terms of CO2, the government doesn't care which emitters make the emissions. However, if there's no, the emission trading market to make sure that the emissions, well, emitter A have emissions lower than this dashed line, so it has to reduce emissions. Probably the cost of reduced emissions from emitter A is very high. However, if we have this emission trading scheme, it means, well, emitter A itself does not necessarily reduce its own emissions. It can ask emitter B to reduce a certain amount of emissions, and then it can buy this amount of emission reduction from emitter B. Well, who will reduce emissions? The market will determine the party that reduce emissions. So if emitter A has a lower cost of emission abatement, emitter A will reduce it. And if emitter B has lower cost, and it will reduce it. So here we say if the emitter B has a lower cost of emission reduction, it will reduce a certain amount of emissions that is equal to the excess CO2 emissions of emitter A, and then emitter A buy this emission reduction from emitter B. So by buying the emission reduction from emitter B, emitter A meets the requirement to reduce some emissions, and the two parties has also achieved economically efficient outcome because the party with a lower cost of emission reduction, it reduce emissions. So this is the most, this is simplest representation of cap and trade or emission trading. Well, in the real world, the story is also similar. So first, for an emission trading scheme, we need to set a cap of emissions, and the government with this emission cap, they send the total emission permits, for free or by auction. Well, so total emission permits are equal to the emission cap. And then firms with, this free allocation or auctioning, they have received the emission permits. And then firms can then decide whether they would like to abate their emissions, or they can also sell or purchase the emission permits. And then with this arrangement, efficient distribution of emission abatement can be achieved, well, under some conditions, and we will see a carbon price emerges, the carbon price of the emission permit. And then the efficient economic outcome will also appear, that is the marginal abatement cost of all the parties participating in the ETS are equalized. So what I was just describing, as I said, was the simplest case. But in the real policy design, there are a lot of issues, and it's very complicated. And this figure from International Carbon Action Partnership has listed a lot of key issues in the ETS design. There are you have seen like 10 items described here. So it's very complicated. So let's just discuss maybe a few of them. First, maybe the scope of the emissions. So the government need to decide what kind of industries that should be covered in the ETS. Well, should we cover power generation sector? Should we cover refineries? Should we cover some small enterprises? And that is a very important question that will determine, the firms or parties participating in the ETS. And the second is the total cap. So assume we have, maybe 100 gigaton, or that's too high, maybe 1 gigatons of emissions before we introduce the ETS. Well, after we introduce the ETS, to what level the government wants, the total emissions of the participating parties to get reduced. So that would be a key question. So before the policy, we have 1 gigaton. If the government want it to be reduced to maybe 900 million tons, there would be a carbon price. And if the government want to reduce to maybe 800 million, 800 million tons, that would be another price. And we can reasonably expect if the government sets the total emission cap lower, the carbon price will be higher. Well, the third issue this figure shows here is the allocation. And the allocation is the key issue. As you can see, well, different entities covered in this emission trading scheme have different permits. And we know the permit will be matched with a certain price after we trade these permits. So the permit is money. And with this market value, the permits that are allocated to the parties would be, matching to a very high amount of money if the emissions from these parties are very high. So that is, a very high stake in this policy design, and the parties, I think intuitively they will lobby for their interest. They will all tell the government, well, we need a lot of permits because it's very costly to reduce emissions in our sector. So then the government needs to make a very wise decision to find a way to reasonably allocate permits to different sectors, to different participating parties in an emission trading scheme. So I just named a few issues in the emission trading scheme. In reality, there will be many more issues to solve, and when we design the ETS. So it is a very challenging task. Okay, so the next section is about the development of the ETS in China. First, let me give a very brief overview of the history, the timeline of the ETS development in China. Back in 2011, like about 10 years ago, China started to design or to build the pilot emission trading markets in 5 cities and 2 provinces in China. And since 2013, these ETS pilots had launched. And in December 2014, the central government issued interim measures about national ETS. So that is the first government document about national ETS. And here, actually in 2015, there's also an important time point when the leaders from China and US made a joint declaration before the Paris Climate Conference before the end of 2015. And in this joint declaration, both leaders from the two countries made promises. So the Chinese promised that, well, we will work together with the US to combat against climate change, and we will show also our leadership in the Paris Climate Conference and in the future climate governance. And China also has formally promised that a national ETS will be built. And also Obama promised that, well, US will also do a lot of things to, address climate change. But unfortunately, as we all know, in 2016, Trump was elected, and we have seen that the US has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. However, on the China side, we have been continuing to do what we promised to do. And with several years of development, in December 2017, a national ETS, well, the system was launched, and the formal development of national ETS has started. And in the recent 1 year, there have been a lot of documents issued, and we are very excited to see in July this year, the national ETS has started trading, and I think it's has been already showing its impact in the emission reduction in a lot of perspectives. And we believe it will significantly contribute to the achievement of China's carbon peaking goal, and also in the end, the China's carbon neutrality goal. And you may ask, why does China choose the ETS? Why China prefer ETS than the carbon tax? Well, there are several major considerations. First, the special design, which I will introduce later, of China's ETS is actually aligned with the overall CO2 emission reduction target or promises that China has made. So the near-term emission reduction target is based on carbon intensity. So China has made pledges on carbon intensity reduction, and the ETS design is actually compatible with this carbon intensity reduction target. And also the ETS is compatible with the governance infrastructure within the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. So Ministry of Ecology and Environment is the responsible ministry, is the ministry that is responsible for the emission trading market design, and also the these CO2 emission reduction. And in a lot of policies designed by the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, MEE, it is related to, regulation about the concentration or the intensity of pollutants. So the ETS of CO2 is also consistent with it. And politically, the ETS also has a higher acceptance compared to the carbon tax. And with the carbon tax, we know all the parties, all the firms that have CO2 emissions must pay the price or the cost of carbon to the government. So for each unit, each ton of CO2 emissions from this firm, it has to pay some tax. And to accept a new tax is always not an easy thing. However, with the ETS, things are not that simple. So as we just showed, and we will also discuss later, not all the firms will have additional cost under the ETS. Some firms, if they are very efficient, if they have relatively lower cost of abatement, they may sell emission permits and earn revenue. It can even earn profit under the ETS. So for these firms, they will say, well, the ETS might be a good thing. So the political feasibility of the ETS is higher because it has limited impacts on firms' profit and also industry competitiveness if we allocate the emission permits for free. And also the ETS is more flexible than the carbon tax. As you can imagine, if we set a rate of tax, a rate of carbon tax, it would be very complicated if we want to change the tax rate. You know, changing a tax rate is not a simple thing. So it needs the approval by the maybe in the Western economies by the Congress, by the Parliament, and in China by the People's Congress. And so that would be a very complicated thing. But we know the carbon price should reflect the marginal abatement cost or the cost of abating carbon, hopefully very timely. So this is not a good feature of carbon tax if the rate is inflexible. But with the emission trading scheme, if we have a cap and trade scheme, the government can just say, or the MEE in China can just say, well, let's lower the emission cap. And then that effectively change the price of the carbon emissions, the price of carbon permits. Or, as I will introduce later, in the current design of China's ETS, the government or the MEE just need to lower the benchmark. So if the benchmark is lowered, the price or the cost of carbon will also increase. And carbon tax also has another complicated issue about the tax revenue management. The revenue management of a tax is not obviously the responsibility of the MEE. It's not reasonable for the ministry that governs the environment handle some tax revenue. So it needs the coordination with maybe Ministry of Finance that will make the cost of the policy design and implementation much higher. And the last reason I just briefly mentioned here is the international experience. The ETS was launched in 2005 in the European Union, and although it was not that successful, it also has some generated very positive impacts. And I must say that during the whole process of the policy making, we must appreciate a lot of support from the international community. So the EU ETS lends a lot of experience to China, and also the other international experts from other countries or regions have also contributed to the policymaking process of the China's ETS. So China has accumulated a lot of knowledge during this phase and learned from the operation of the ETS in other countries or regions, dominantly the European Union. And as I discussed, China has started its domestic emission trading scheme pilots in 2011. And with this kind of path dependence, at the national level, when the carbon pricing tool was designed, the ETS was also chosen. Well, although the national ETS was chosen, it does not necessarily say the carbon tax won't play a role in the future. we expect carbon tax might be introduced in the future as a complementary policy. However, this needs the coordination between the MEE and other, tax management government authorities like the Ministry of Finance or State Taxation Administration. So here is a very brief overview of the design of China's national ETS. So the ETS started from the power sector. It has covered more than 2,000 power generation firms. The total emission exceeded 4 billion tons. That's really a very high number. It accounts roughly 10% of the global emission, or maybe roughly 40% of China's national emissions. So the power sector only has, this astounding size. The trading was started on July the 16th, and in the last 4 months, the price was around 15 yuan per ton. And exchange is in Shanghai. The registry where the book of the permits was kept is in Wuhan. And about the scope of the China's national ETS, so first there's an emission threshold to determine whether firms should be covered. So that's one condition of the firm coverage. So the China's national ETS for now set the threshold as 26,000 tons of CO2 emissions. It roughly corresponds to energy consumption about 10,000 tons of coal equivalent. And if we apply this threshold to the sectors that the China's ETS expect to cover, about 7,500 firms are expected to cover by the end of 14th five-year plan, which is 2025. And the sectors to be covered besides the power sector will include some other energy intensive sectors like iron and steel, non-ferrous metal, construction material, and so on. And important feature of China's national ETS is that both direct emissions from fossil fuel combustion and also indirect emissions associated with the use of electricity and heat will be also accounted as emissions from firms. And then let's talk about how the cap of China's national ETS is set. And relatedly, how the allowances or emission permits are allocated. So here we will also see a very special feature of China's ETS. So the China's ETS is not a classic emission cap and trade or emission trading market with a fixed cap. So it's actually output adjusted or a rate-based emission trading scheme. There's a very important concept in this special design called benchmarking or a benchmark. So here again, let's show a simplest example of China's emission trading scheme design with just 2 firms in a very small world. Now in this very small world, we have 2 firms and we only have one benchmark. So the firm on the left is plant 1, is a power generation plant, and it has a relatively low energy efficiency. And as you see, the low energy efficiency means relatively high CO2 intensity. CO2 intensity means the CO2 emissions from 1 unit of electricity. So this low efficiency plant have a certain level of CO2 intensity, and the government set a benchmark. So the government sets a benchmark that is lower than the plant 1's CO2 intensity. The benchmark means for each unit of electricity generation, the government will give you this amount of CO2 permits. Then for plant 1, for each unit of electricity generated, the permit it's received from the government is actually lower than its CO2 emissions from 1 unit of electricity generation. So then the plant 1 face an issue. So it does not have the enough emission permits. It has to either reduce its emissions or buy some emission permits or allowances from the other firm. So on the right, for the other firm, this is a high efficiency plant. It has CO2 intensity lower than the benchmark set by the government. It means that for each unit of electricity generation, for each kilowatt hour electricity this plant 2 generates, it has lower emissions than the free permits that it received from the government. It means for every unit of electricity it generates, it has now additional revenue from the government because it have access permits to sell to the plant on the left. So with a carbon market, the plant 1 will buy allowances from plant 2. So it will buy allowances and pay money to the plant 2. So here, this is the design of the so-called rate base or benchmark. I think the key issue that I want to emphasize again here, this market has not set a cap because we don't know how much electricity that plant 1 and plant 2 generate. The policy or the benchmarks is just related to the unit of electricity generation, well, the CO2 emissions that the government's allowed for a unit of electricity generation. So the total cap of emissions is not exogenously set by the government. That's why we say there would be a floating emission cap of this power sector. So the total cap, the emission cap, would be equal to the total allowances or permits sent by the government. The total permits would be actually the Q times B times F. So ignore the F here. F in the real policy design, that would be a correction factor. So that's a minor term. But the major terms are Q and B. The B is the benchmark, and the Q is the total electricity generation. And this is unknown before an emission trading scheme is operated. So the cap is determined by both benchmark and the quantity. So that's why we say the emission cap is floating. So it is a desirable design for developing countries in China because the economic growth is still very dynamic. We don't know the exact electricity demand. So that's why we would like the Q to be flexible. And then, the A is flexible, but the B, the benchmark, still plays a very important role to reduce emissions from sectors. For example, for the power sector, if we rank the CO2 emissions per unit of electricity generation from low to high, we'll see with this kind of benchmark, the high efficiency plants lower than the benchmark on the left will essentially will be subsidized by the government with this permit, with this the ETS design. And the low efficiency firms will be taxed because for each unit of electricity generated, there is a short of permits. They need to buy additional permits if they don't reduce emissions from the others. So essentially, they face a tax. And I just briefly mentioned that to run the ETS very effectively, there are a lot of other issues. A very critical issue is the MRV. MRV is short for measuring, reporting, and verification of the emissions. So here is just a framework that shows the governing infrastructure of China's national ETS for the emission data quality. You see, it's kind of complicated, but it's very important to make sure that the government knows accurately how much emissions are generated for each firm. So that is very important for the integrity and the effectiveness of the ETS. And we'll skip some other design features. Well, because personally, I don't trade in this market. So we'll skip the trading rules, risk management, and the compliance penalty and offset issues. So if you are interested, I believe you can find a lot of information about all kind of very detailed features of China's national ETS on the internet. And the last page about the overall design of the China's ETS is this kind of a roadmap of China's ETS development. So as we've seen, the China's ETS history, or the formal operation of China's ETS scheme, starts from the regional ETS pilots from 2013, and the trial phase started in 2018, and with 3 years of construction, the ETS has formally started this year, and now there's a national ETS and the regional ETS pilots run in parallel. And as I said, the national ETS is a rate-based system. And maybe after 2025, with more emission trajectory that can be forecasted or expected, the whole ETS system may be transferred to a mass-based system. And the national ETS will take a dominant role in this whole ETS design. And if you are interested, we recently have an article, unfortunately just in Chinese, in this journal about some detailed rationale of China's national ETS design. So if you are interested, you can download this article. So lastly, I will briefly discuss the impacts of China's ETS on its power system decarbonization. And these results I will discuss is based on a joint report that our Institute of Energy, Environment and Economy, Tsinghua University, did with the International Energy Agency, the IEA. So we jointly published this report called The Role of China's ETS in Power Sector Decarbonization. And this report is free, is on IEA's website, and you can freely download this report for some more detailed settings and discussions of our work. So here in this study, in this report, not like what we discuss in a simple word, in a small word, we simulate China's ETS design in the power sector with very detailed representation in a modeling tool that we developed for several years at our institute. This modeling tool is a capacity expansion and operation model. So this model just is an optimization model, and this numerical model finds the optimal capacity mix and of the power technology in China, and it also finds the most efficient operation scheme to achieve the minimal cost. So in this model, we have power generation technologies shown in the the right columns of this table. So it actually includes model all kind of different electricity generation technology in this model. And for China's ETS design, well, actually we don't have only one benchmark. We have actually 4 benchmarks. So that's reflected the real policy design of China's ETS. For the power sector, there are 4 benchmarks. So there are 3 benchmarks for coal and 1 benchmark for gas. For example, for the if I am a supercritical 600 megawatt plant, I will find a corresponding benchmark here, and I will know, well, how many permits that I will receive for 1 unit or 1 kilowatt hour electricity that I generated. And then I compare this number, this benchmark, to the emission intensity of my plant. And if I fortunately find that, well, my plant is very efficient, I have emission intensity lower than the plant, I can sell the emission permit. But if not, well, I have to do something to reduce my emission intensity or to improve the energy efficiency, or I need to pay additional money to buy permits from other plants. So here, in our model, we simulate the actual design of benchmark setting in China's power sector under China's national ETS. And we have 3 scenarios. The first scenario is a scenario just for reference. Assume that we do not have any emission reduction policy. If we do not have the emission trading scheme, what will happen? And then we set another emission trading scheme as we have for now for China's ETS. We have free allocation. The factories, the plants receive emission permits for free, and then the benchmarks is tightening over time. And we also simulate another scenario. In this policy scenario, the benchmark is the same as what we use in the ETS scenario, except that a certain share of permits will be auctioned. So it will not be free allocated to the firms. So this amount of permits had to be auctioned, or the firm had to pay some money to bid for these permits. So there would be additional cost for the firms, to get the permits. And then obviously the firm will have some additional incentive to reduce their emissions. So then, well, in this study, we compare the results from these scenarios. So if we compare the ETS scenario with a scenario with no carbon pricing, we'll see China's power sector emission compared to a no carbon pricing scenario will peak before 2030. So that is very important for China's emission peaking goal to be achieved. And this model also tells, well, with this kind of setting, what level the allowance price would be. So, we may say, well, it would be higher than 100 yuan per ton in 2025, and it may continue to increase if we have well, this is just, from the model, it's just a simulation. So it could be higher later. And we also calculate the unit electricity cost change in these 2 scenarios. And we will also see the average electricity cost will not increase very much. And in this model, we can also see what the mechanisms of emission reduction under the current design of China's ETS. as I have already introduced, the China's ETS is output-based ETS. So this special design drives emission reduction mainly by improving the coal power efficiency, and maybe in the future, the carbon capture and utilization, carbon capture utilization and storage deployment. So as we can see from this figure, if we decompose the emission reduction into different mechanisms, and we will see the mechanism of switching from less and more efficient coal technologies represented in these light blue bars dominated in the emission reduction in early years. This means the China's output-based emissions will incentivize the high efficient power plant to generate more electricity, and the low efficient power plant generates less electricity. So this shift, can achieve emission reduction. So this dominated in the early phase of the ETS. But with a higher carbon price, the ETS we expect will also incentivize the deployment of the carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, maybe after 2030. So that's why we see the dark blue bars representing the emission reduction from switching from unabated coal, the regular coal power generation technology, to coal plus CCS. And notably, the green bars representing the switching from fossil to non-fossil technologies only takes a very small share, because the current design, the output-based emission trading scheme in China's power sector only covers the fossil fuel-based technologies. As we've shown, that's just coal and gas. So it does not provide very strong additional incentive for renewables. So we need the other policies to support the renewable development. And as I discussed earlier, the ETS will encourage the shift to the ultra supercritical generation, so the most efficient technology of the coal power technology, and improve the average efficiency of China's coal power. So if we compare the ETS scenario with the no policy scenario, we'll see the light green bar representing the generation share of the ultra supercritical technology increase significantly. And we will also see in later years, the CCUS will increase a lot. It will replace this light red bar, will replace significant generation from the dark red bar representing the unabated coal technologies. And now we compare what the auctioning tells us. If we have the ETS auctioning, we'll see the total emissions from the power sector will further decrease. And if we look at the power mix, if we have the increasing auctioning share in the ETS for the power sector, the non-fossil generation, for example, the solar wind, will also significantly increase. This is because with auctioning, the fossil-based technology will incur additional cost. So the competitiveness of solar and wind will increase. So there is more solar and wind here. And if we see the decomposition figure again, compared to the ETS scenario, the ETS auctioning scenario provides strong incentives for fuel switching and structural transition. We'll see the switching from fossil to non-fossil technology is much larger. The light green bars are much larger in the ETS auctioning scenario compared to the current ETS scenario without auctioning. So the auctioning potentially could play a very important role to further decarbonize China's power sector. Okay, here is a very brief summary about what I discussed today. So a key message is that the China's national ETS that we have for now is an output or rate-based system rather than a mass-based system. The mass-based system means the total emission cap is exogenous, is determined ex ante before we run the trading by the government. But China's national ETS for now is a rate-based system. So we only know the total emissions exposed after the trading of the whole year. So China's rate-based national ETS is also called, or essentially, a multi-sector tradable performance standards. So this is the academic term that we call the rate-based system. It is multi-sector because during the 14th five-year plan, some more sectors will be covered by the ETS, not only the power sector. So the large firms in 8 energy-intensive sectors will be included. So these sectors will be covered by the ETS, and for each sector, there would be maybe one or several benchmarks. These benchmarks are called, performance standards. And in this national ETS, the firms from different sectors can trade their permits. So that's why we call it multi-sector tradable performance standard. And we expect by the end of 14th five-year plan in 2025, the national ETS will cover approximately more 7,500 enterprises. It will represent about 7 billion metric tons of CO2, or about 70% of China's total CO2 emissions. And lastly, about some future directions for China's national ETS development, we expect the China's ETS will gradually transition to a mass-based ETS at appropriate timing. And also, as we see, the auctioning could also be important to make the ETS function more effectively. So we may increase the portion of the auction gradually in the future. And another very important direction is to tighten the benchmarks of covered sectors. The benchmarks, as we said, is the performance standard. It will, require the firms to have better performance, to set higher standards, and to lower the benchmark. The lower the benchmark means the permits that the firms received from the government for a unit level of output will be fewer. So the firms need to further reduce its emission intensity, or it has to buy from the other more efficient firms. And also, we also expect the China's national ETS will gradually merge the China's ETS pilots, because there will be a very important, the national policy tool to push forward the national transition, the transition of the whole country to get decarbonized. And China will also prepare to cooperate with other countries and regions in the under the international ETS framework to combat against climate change globally. So that's all I have today for today. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, I think we may have about 10 or 15 minutes for for Q&A. So I think if any of you have questions, I'm happy to answer. I noticed that in the message box, there is one question. So from Erica, she asked, what are the foreseeable economic impact